There is a kind of woman the West never quite knew what to do with. Not the broken kind, and not the bold kind either, but the quiet, steady kind, who kept going long after the reasonable thing would have been to stop. Willa Beckett was that kind. She had been a wife, and then she had not been. She had been a woman with a plan, and then the plan had come apart in the way plans do when the ground beneath them shifts without warning. By the Tuesday, she first rolled her cart to the edge of Harlan Creek's main street. She had $11. 2 children who were not hers by blood, but were hers in every way that counted. And a reputation she had inherited like bad weather, without deserving it and without being asked. She baked. That was the word people used when they spoke of her, if they spoke of her at all. She baked the way some women pray, early and alone, and with a seriousness that asked nothing back. Her bread came out of the oven with a weight to it, a warmth that lasted longer than bread had any right to. Her pies were the kind that made a man set down whatever he was carrying and just stand there for a moment. Not because they were fancy, because they were true. There is a difference, and most people know it when they taste it, even if they could not say the words. The town of Harlan Creek was not a cruel place. It was simply a careful one. It had seen enough widows arrive with children and debts and dignity wrapped around them like a shawl, and it had learned to wait before it decided anything. So it waited. It watched Willa set up her cart 3 mornings a week. It watched her count change with steady hands and speak to her customers in a voice that never once asked for pity. It watched the 2 small children sit on the cart's backboard and eat the heels of yesterday's loaves while their guardians sold the good parts. And it reserved its judgment, which in a small town is almost the same thing as withholding it. Daniel Holt had not come to Harlan Creek looking for anything. That much was plain from the way he moved. Not urgently, not with the particular restlessness of a man hunting something down. He came because the road came, and because Coldwater Ranch was at the end of it, and because the ranch needed tending and he was by nature a man who tended things. He had a way of going quiet when other men would speak, and a way of speaking when other men would go loud, and neither of these habits had ever made him popular exactly. But they had made him someone people trusted without entirely knowing why. He stopped at Willa's cart on a Tuesday morning because the smell came off the bread and stopped him where he stood. He bought a loaf. He said 4 words, and those 4 words set something in motion that neither of them would have predicted, and neither of them in the end would have taken back. Some stories begin with a grand gesture, a rescue, a declaration, a dramatic turn in the weather of a life. This is not that kind of story. This is the slower kind, the kind that moves the way a river moves under winter ice, quietly, steadily, with a force that does not announce itself until the thaw comes and suddenly everything is different and you realize the moving never stopped. It is a story about bread and about children and about a lease paid in silence and about what a person becomes when someone finally treats them as if they are worth the trouble of being treated well. It begins on a Tuesday in Harlan Creek. It ends somewhere warmer than that. The cart was not much to look at. It was a flat wooden thing on 2 wheels with a rail along one side that Willa Beckett had fixed herself with a borrowed hammer and 3 nails she had straightened after pulling them from an old fence post. She had painted the rail white the previous spring, and by Tuesday of that October, it had gone gray and was beginning to split at the corner where the weather had got into it. She did not apologize for the cart. She did not draw attention to it either. She simply set it at the edge of Harlan Creek's main street, arranged her loaves and her pies in the order she always arranged them, and began. She had been doing this for 14 months, not every day. She could not afford the flour for every day, but 3 mornings a week, Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday. She was there before the light was full. Clara helped her load the cart at the house. Eli was still too small to carry much without dropping it, but he tried, and Willa let him try. because a child who is allowed to try becomes a child who believes he is capable, and she thought that was worth a dropped pie now and then. They walked the half-mile to the street together, the three of them, the cart between them, and if the town noticed the picture they made, it did not say so to her face. Willa Beckett had arrived in Harlan Creek 3 years prior as a wife. She had left that condition when her husband, a man named George Beckett, died of a fever that took him in 4 days without ceremony or farewell. He was not a bad man. He was not a good one either, in the way that matters most. He was simply a man who had meant well and managed less, and who left behind him a piece of land with a lease, 2 debts at the land office, and nothing else worth counting. Willa had paid the first debt with what she had in the cedar chest. The second debt she had paid with a year of bread and pies, and the kind of stubborn arithmetic that leaves no margin for rest. The children were her sisters. Ruth had died in childbirth with Eli, and the man Ruth had married had gone west and not come back, which in Willa's estimation told you everything you needed to know about him. Clara had been 4 when she came to Willa. Eli had been 4 days old. Willa did not speak of this as a sacrifice. She did not speak of it at all, mostly. They were her children now, in the way that a thing becomes yours when you are the one who shows up for it every morning without being asked. Harlan Creek was a town of approximately 300 souls, depending on the season, and whether you counted the men who wintered at the mining camp up the pass. It had a general store, a livery, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a saloon that the church pretended not to notice, and a land office run by a man named Pruitt, who had the particular kind of smile that made you want to count your fingers after shaking his hand. The town had a way of knowing things it had no right to know, and of forming opinions before the facts were entirely in. Willa understood this. She did not fight it. She simply conducted herself as a woman who had nothing to hide, which was the truth, and waited for the town to notice. Some of the town had noticed. Mrs. Alderman at the general store bought a loaf every Thursday and said nothing particular, but always managed to be at the window when Willa set up. Old Hector, who ran the livery, had once stopped his work entirely to watch Clara mind the cart while Willa made change, and when Willa caught him looking, he had simply nodded, which she understood as a form of respect from a man who gave it rarely. There were others, but there was also Martha Gill, who lived in the greenhouse on the corner, and who was the kind of woman who worried about propriety the way other women worried about the weather, constantly, publicly, and with a certainty that the worst was coming. Martha Gill had opinions about Willa Beckett. She aired them selectively, which made them travel farther than if she had simply spoken them aloud. The bread was the thing. Willa had learned to bake from her mother, who had learned it from hers. And somewhere back in that line of women there had been someone who understood bread not as a recipe, but as a practice. A thing you did with your whole attention, or you did not do at all. Willa's loaves came out with a crust that gave under the knife, and a crumb that held together, and they smelled the way bread is supposed to smell, and so rarely does, which is to say they smelled like something worth stopping for. Her pies, molasses and dried apple in the fall, whatever she could put up in summer, were the kind that did not announce themselves. They simply delivered. People in Harlan Creek had come to rely on this without quite admitting to it, and on Tuesday mornings there was often a small queue before she had finished arranging the rail. That particular Tuesday, the sky was the color of pewter, and the air had the first real bite of the season in it. Willa wore her good coat, which was not very good, and she had put Clara's hair up in the way Clara liked, with the ribbon that had come from the cedar chest and was used only on selling days. Eli sat on the backboard of the cart with his legs hanging, and ate the heel of a loaf, and watched the street with the particular focus of a 4-year-old who finds everything equally interesting, and therefore notices everything. Willa stood behind the rail and kept her hands still, and waited, the way she had learned to wait. Not impatiently, not resignedly, but simply as a woman who understands that the next thing will come when it comes. She did not see Daniel Holt approach. She was making change for Mrs. Alderman and concentrating on the coins, which were worn and sometimes difficult to distinguish by feel alone. She heard him before she saw him, not because he made noise, but because she noticed the particular quality of a silence that a person makes when they have stopped moving. She looked up. He was standing 3 feet from the cart, holding his hat in one hand and looking at the bread the way a man looks at something he is trying to place. Not hungrily, not casually, but with a kind of careful attention, as if he were trying to understand what it was that had stopped him. He was not a young man. He was somewhere in the middle of his life, with the look of a man who had done a good deal of outdoor work and had not found much occasion to talk about it. His coat was clean. His boots were worn but kept. He had the kind of stillness about him that is not shyness and is not coldness, but is something else entirely. The stillness of a man who has learned that most situations will clarify themselves if you give them a moment, and who has decided to give them the moment and see. He stood there looking at the bread. Then he looked at Willa. Then he looked at the bread again. "You bake like an angel," he said. It was not the beginning of a long speech. It was, as it turned out, nearly the whole of what he said that morning. Willa looked at him for a moment without answering, the way she looked at things she was not yet sure of. Then she said, "Thank you, sir. Would you like a loaf?" It was not quite a question. He said he would. He paid without haggling, which some men did even when the prices were fair. He tucked the loaf under his arm and put his hat back on, and stood there another moment, as if there were something else he had meant to say, and was deciding whether to say it. He looked at Clara, who looked back at him with the frank assessment of a 7-year-old. He looked at Eli, who waved. He did not smile exactly, but the corner of his mouth moved. Then he said he had a ranch up the Coldwater Road, and that he was in need of a cook, if she was interested in the work. And he named a wage that was more than she was making in a week of cart days. He said it plainly, without flattery and without pressure, the way a man states a fact he believes to be useful. Then he waited. Some things are too large for naming in the moment they arrive. Willa looked at her loaves. She looked at Clara. She looked at Eli, still eating his heel of bread on the backboard of a cart with a split rail and 3 straightened nails. Then she looked back at the man who had not given her his name yet, and she said she would think on it, and she said it in the tone of a woman who has already started thinking. She thought on it for 2 days, which was longer than she needed, and shorter than caution would have advised. She asked around, quietly, in the way a careful woman asks. Not directly, not in a way that announced itself as asking. She mentioned Coldwater Ranch to old Hector at the livery, and he said Daniel Holt had run it alone for going on 2 years and that the place was in decent order considering. She mentioned the name to Mrs. Alderman, who said he paid his accounts on time and did not make trouble, and that in her experience those 2 things together told you more about a man than most of what people chose to talk about. Martha Gill, who overheard the name in passing, said she hoped Willa knew what she was doing, in the tone of a woman who did not believe she did. Willa thanked her and went home and baked a fresh loaf and thought about the wage he had named, and about the lease, and about the winter coming. And by Thursday morning she had made up her mind. She sent word with a boy from the church school and received back a note in a plain hand that said Thursday afternoon would suit, and gave directions to the ranch in the particular manner of a man who assumes you can follow a landmark without being led by the hand. The directions were good. The ranch sat at the end of a road that ran along a creek, lined with cottonwoods gone yellow with the season. And when Willa came over the last rise with the cart and the children and the cedar chest loaded in the back, she saw the house before she saw the man. It was a low, wide house of weathered timber, with a porch along the front and a good stone chimney, and a barn to the left that was larger than the house, which told you something about the man's priorities. The pasture beyond the barn was fenced with new posts in some places and old ones in others, which told you something about his resources. The whole of it sat in a shallow valley with pine-covered hills on three sides, and the kind of quiet that is not emptiness but fullness, too much space for sound to fill. Daniel Holt came out of the barn when he heard the cart. He was in his work clothes, which were the same as his other clothes by the look of it, and he had a bridle in one hand that he had apparently been mending. He nodded at Willa and then looked at Clara and Eli in the back of the cart with an expression that was not surprise exactly, more like a man confirming something he had already accounted for. He did not make a production of it. He set the bridle on the porch rail and came down the steps and offered to carry the cedar chest. And when Willa said she could manage it, he did not argue, but he took the heavier end without asking, and between them they got it inside without difficulty. This was the first negotiation they conducted together, and neither of them remarked on it. The inside of the house was clean in the way a man's house is clean when he has been the only one in it for a long time. Nothing out of place, nothing decorative, nothing that did not serve a function. There was a table and 4 chairs, which Willa noted. There was a good iron stove and a row of hooks by the door, and a braided rug that had seen better years but had been kept swept. The bedroom off the kitchen was to be hers and the children's, he said, and he had put a cot in there for the small one. He himself slept in the room at the back. He showed her the kitchen stores: flour, salt, lard, dried beans, a good supply of lamp oil, 2 crocks of molasses, with the matter-of-fact thoroughness of a man transferring responsibility for something he trusts will be cared for. He did not hover. He showed her, and then he went back outside, and that was the arrangement. Willa stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left and looked at the stove and the stores and the window above the basin that faced east and would catch the morning light. Clara stood beside her with her hands folded, watching her guardian's face the way children watch the faces of the adults they depend on. Reading for information, the adult has not yet spoken. Eli had already gone to the braided rug and sat down on it as if it had been his rug for some time. Willa looked at the window. She looked at the stove. Then she put on her apron and began. The first supper she cooked at Coldwater Ranch was a simple thing: beans and salt pork and cornbread, and the last of a jar of apples she had put up in August. She set the table for 4 without thinking about it, and it was only when Daniel came in from the barn and stopped for a fraction of a second at the sight of the set table that she realized it had been some time since that table had been set for more than one. He sat down. Clara sat across from him and regarded him with the steady, evaluating look she gave to all new things. Eli sat beside Willa and knocked his spoon off the table twice. Daniel picked it up the first time and set it back without comment. The second time, Eli picked it up himself and looked at Daniel to see if he would say something. Daniel did not say anything. He passed the cornbread. The children asked him questions the way children ask questions, without preamble, without tact, and with a completeness of attention that most adults have forgotten how to give. Clara asked him if he had a horse. He said he had 3. She asked if she could see them. He said after supper. Eli asked if the barn had cats. He said 2. Eli asked their names. He said he had not named them. Eli considered this seriously and said he would name them, and Daniel said that was all right with him. And somewhere in that exchange, something that had been stiff in the room became less so. Willa brought the molasses to the table and said nothing, but she noted the exchange the way she noted most things, quietly, and with more attention than she showed. The days that followed had a shape to them quickly, which was how Willa preferred things. She rose before the light and had the stove going and the first pot on before the children woke. Daniel was always already outside by the time she came down, which she understood was not indifference but consideration. That he had decided, without discussing it, to give her the kitchen in the mornings as her own space. He came in for breakfast and ate without waste, and said what needed saying and went back to the work. Midday he came in again, and in the evenings he sat at the table until the lamp needed trimming, sometimes with a piece of harness to work on, sometimes doing nothing she could name, simply sitting in the way a man sits when he is not asking for anything and has nowhere else to be. He did not speak a great deal. What he said was plain, and meant what it said, and he did not say more than was needed, which Willa found restful in a way she had not expected. George Beckett had been a man who talked to fill space, and the space had never been filled. Daniel Holt's silences filled the room in a different way entirely. Not heavily, not uncomfortably, but the way a good fire fills a room, with a warmth that did not demand attention but was noticed when you stopped to notice it. She did not say this to anyone. She was not sure yet what it meant, or whether it meant anything at all, but she noticed it. She set the supper table each evening for 4 people, and each evening it felt less like an assumption and more like a fact, and she was not sure when the change had happened, only that it had. By the end of the 2nd week, Eli had named the barn cats Molasses and Nail, for reasons he explained at length to Daniel one morning, while Daniel was mending fence near the barn door. Daniel listened to the full explanation with the same attention he gave to things he considered worth understanding. When Eli finished, Daniel said that were good names. Eli said he thought so too. Willa, carrying water from the pump, heard this through the open barn door and did not stop walking, but the corner of her mouth moved in a way it had not moved in some time. The talk started, as talk in small towns usually does, not with a lie, but with a true thing said in the wrong tone. Martha Gill had seen Willa loading the cart on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after she had gone to Coldwater Ranch, and she had noted the cedar chest was gone from the house, and she had drawn her conclusions with the speed and certainty of a woman who has been drawing conclusions her whole life and has never once stopped to check her arithmetic. By Sunday after the service, the shape of the story had traveled the length of Harlan Creek's main street and back, and by Monday it had acquired details that no one could have known because they were not true. The version Martha Gill told was not malicious in its intent. It was simply careless in its effect, which in Willa's experience amounted to the same thing. The version that reached Pruitt at the land office had been refined by the time it got to him, the way water refines a stone, smoothed into something more useful for his purposes. Pruitt was a man who collected information the way other men collected debts, patiently and with an eye toward what it might one day be worth. He had wanted the lease on Willa's land for 2 seasons, not because the land was exceptional, but because it sat between 2 parcels he already held, and the arrangement offended his sense of order. He had made her a low offer the previous spring, and she had declined it in the particular way she declined things, without drama, without anger, simply as a woman who has looked at a thing and found it insufficient. He had not forgotten the declining. Men like Pruitt rarely do. He rode out to Coldwater Ranch on a Wednesday, which was not an accident. He had reasoned, correctly, that a Wednesday was a day when the ranch would be at its quietest, and the man of the place most likely to be far out in the pasture and out of convenient reach. He arrived mid-morning and tied his horse at the post and knocked at the door with the brisk, proprietary knock of a man who believes he is doing you a favor by showing up. Willa opened the door. She recognized him. She did not step back from the doorway, which told him something, and she did not invite him in, which told him something else. She stood in the frame with her hands at her sides and waited for him to say what he had come to say. He said it pleasantly enough. He said he had heard she was in a difficult position with the lease, and that he was prepared to improve his previous offer as an act of good faith, and he named a figure that was higher than the last, but still well below what the land was worth to anyone who was not in a hurry. He said it with the smile that made you want to count your fingers afterward. He said he imagined she had a great deal on her plate these days, what with the children and the new arrangement, and that it might be a relief to simplify her situation. The word arrangement carried a weight he had put there deliberately, and they both knew it. Willa looked at him for a moment, the way she looked at things she had already decided about. She said the land was not for sale. She said it in the same tone she used for everything, even unhurried, without heat. Pruitt began to say something further, something about the difficulty of a woman managing a lease on her own income, and he was still saying it when he became aware that someone else was present. He turned. Daniel Holt was standing at the corner of the porch. He had come from the direction of the barn, not the pasture, and he had apparently been there for some portion of the conversation. He was not holding anything. He was not positioned in any way that could be called threatening. He was simply standing there the way a man stands when he is exactly where he intends to be and has no plans to be anywhere else. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not step toward Pruitt. He looked at him with the steady, unhurried look of a man who has a great deal of patience and is prepared to use all of it, and he said that the lady had given her answer. That was the whole of what he said. There was something in the way he said it that made the sentence longer than its words. Not a threat, nothing so crude as that, but a kind of certainty that occupied the air the way cold occupies a room when a door is opened in winter. Pruitt looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Willa. Then he untied his horse and rode back toward town without the thing he had come for, and he did not look back, which was perhaps the most honest thing about him. Willa watched him go from the doorway. She did not say anything immediately. Daniel came up onto the porch and stood beside her, and also watched. And the two of them stood there together in the particular silence of people who have just been through something and are taking a moment to let it settle. After a time, Willa went inside. Daniel went back to the barn. Neither of them spoke of what had happened. Some things do not need to be spoken of in order to be understood, and in Willa's experience, the things that fall into that category are often the most important ones. That evening, she made supper without haste. A proper supper, not a tired evening supper, with a good pot of beans and the last of the salt pork and biscuits that came out of the oven the way her biscuits always came out, with a color and a smell that made the kitchen feel like a different place than it had been before they were in it. She set the table. She put the molasses in the center where everyone could reach it. Clara had picked a spray of dried grass from the field and put it in a tin cup on the sill, the way she had seen Willa do in better seasons, and Willa let it stay. Daniel came in and hung his coat and sat down and looked at the table for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. Not surprise, not quite that, but something adjacent to it, something that a man wears when he has been given more than he expected and is not yet sure how to hold it. They ate. Eli knocked his spoon off the table once and retrieved it himself without being asked, which made Clara announce this achievement to the table as if she had accomplished it personally. Daniel said that was good. Clara said she had been teaching him. Daniel said she was a good teacher. Clara accepted this with the gravity of a 7-year-old who has been waiting for someone to confirm what she already knew. The meal went on in this way, with the children filling the spaces that needed filling, and the two adults saying what needed saying and leaving the rest where it was, in the comfortable quiet between people who have begun, without declaring it, to trust one another. The talk in town did not disappear. Talk in small towns does not disappear so much as it shifts, moves from one corner to another, changes shape, and eventually becomes part of the weather, something people mention and then stop mentioning because it has been there too long to be interesting. Martha Gill still had her opinions. Pruitt still had his. But old Hector had started nodding at Willa with a slightly different quality to the nod when she came to the livery, and Mrs. Alderman had taken to setting aside a pound of good flour on Thursdays without being asked, which was as close to a statement of allegiance as a woman like Mrs. Alderman was likely to make. The town was watching, as it always watched. But the thing it was watching had changed. The story it was forming about Willa Beckett was no longer quite the one Martha Gill had started. Stories, like people, have a way of correcting themselves when they are given enough time and enough evidence. Harlan Creek was beginning to collect the evidence, and the evidence was supper on the table every evening, and 2 children fed, and a ranch in better order than it had been in 2 years, and a woman who had been given a low offer and declined it in the tone of someone who knows what she is worth and is content to wait for the world to catch up. The first snow came on a Sunday, which was earlier than anyone had predicted, and earlier than the valley usually allowed. Will awoke to the particular silence that snow makes. Not an absence of sound exactly, but a muffling of it, as if the world had pulled something heavy over itself in the night. She lay still for a moment and listened to it, and then she got up and lit the stove and stood at the east window while the kettle came to heat and watched the white come down through the pines in the gray light before sunrise. The corral posts had caps of snow on them already. The barn roof had gone white. The creek she could not see from the window, but she knew it was still running beneath whatever the cold had begun to put over it, moving the way things move when they have no choice but to continue. The pass, she knew, would close within 2 weeks if the snow kept. She had been aware of this in the way she was aware of most things that had consequences. Quietly, continuously, without letting it become something she wore on her face. She had been at Coldwater Ranch for 6 weeks by then, and in those 6 weeks the shape of her life had changed in ways she had not planned for and was not yet certain how to name. The work was good. The children were settled in the way children settle when they are warm and fed and spoken to with consistency. The ranch was running. These were facts. What lay beneath them, what they added up to in the larger arithmetic, was something she had not allowed herself to calculate, because some calculations, once you begin them, cannot be stopped in the middle. She had been thinking about the lease, not with panic. Panic was a luxury she had learned early she could not afford, but with the steady practical attention she gave to all problems that had a deadline attached to them. The lease came due in February. What she had saved from the wage Daniel paid her was enough for 1 month's renewal, perhaps 2 if she was careful. Beyond that, the numbers did not work without something changing, and she had not yet decided what she was prepared to ask to change, and what she was not. She was not a woman who asked easily. She had learned that asking changed the shape of a thing between people, and she was careful about shapes. It was Clara who settled it, on a Tuesday morning at the breakfast table, without knowing she was settling anything at all. The 4 of them were at the table with the stove going and the snow still coming down outside the window, and Daniel had come in from the early feeding with cold on his coat and sat down and taken his coffee the way he always took it. Both hands. No hurry. Clara had been telling Eli something about the barn cats, about how Molasses had learned to come when you called, but Nail had not, and probably never would. And she was explaining this with the authority of someone who has studied the question at length. And Eli was listening with the openness of someone who trusts the source completely. And then Clara, without pausing, without any change in the register of her voice, turned to Daniel and said, "Will you teach me to ride in the spring, Papa?" It was not quite a question. It was the way a child says a thing she has been thinking for some time and has finally decided is safe to say aloud. The table went quiet. Not uncomfortably, more in the way a room goes quiet when something enters it that everyone recognizes as significant and no one wants to disturb with the wrong word. Daniel looked at Clara. He looked at her with the full, unhurried attention he gave to things he considered worth understanding. The way a man looks at something he is trying not to mishandle. Clara looked back at him with the steady, waiting look of a child who has made herself vulnerable and is watching to see what will be done with it. Eli had stopped eating and was watching Daniel with his spoon held in the air. Willa did not move. She did not look at Daniel. She looked at her coffee cup and kept her hands around it and waited, the way she had learned to wait without letting the waiting show. Daniel said, "Yes." He said it simply and without qualification, and then he picked up his coffee cup and drank from it, and Clara nodded as if this confirmed what she had believed, and Eli put his spoon back in his bowl and went on eating. The meal continued. But something had been said that could not be unsaid, and all four of them at that table knew it, and none of them said so, which was the right way to handle it. Some things are too large for naming in the moment they arrive. You simply let them settle, and see what shape they take when the settling is done. Daniel rode to town that afternoon. He said he had business at the land office and left without further explanation, which was consistent with his character, and gave Willa nothing to interpret. She did not try to interpret it. She made bread and kept the children in from the cold, and told herself she was not watching for his return, and watched for it anyway. He came back before dark, which the shortened days had pulled to an earlier and earlier hour. He put up his horse. He came inside and hung his coat and reached into his coat pocket and set a folded paper on the table beside the bread she had left there to cool. He did not hand it to her. He set it down, which was a different thing, and went to the basin to wash his hands. Willa looked at the paper. She looked at it for a moment without touching it. The way you look at something you suspect will change your understanding of your situation, and you want one more second of not knowing before you do. Then she picked it up and unfolded it. It was a receipt from the county clerk's office. The lease on her land had been paid in full through the following December. Not 1 month, not 2, but a full year past the February due date. The amount was noted in plain figures. Daniel's name was not on the receipt, but the clerk's office stamp was. And it was dated that afternoon, and she was not a woman who needed things spelled out. She stood at the table holding the paper. Daniel dried his hands on the cloth by the basin and did not look at her, not because he was avoiding her, but because he understood, the way he seemed to understand most things, that she needed a moment and that the right thing to do with a person who needs a moment is to give it to them without making it into something. He moved to the stove and checked the fire, and added a piece of wood and replaced the iron door with the quiet efficiency of a man who is very comfortable in a room and very comfortable in his own silence. Willa stood at the table for that moment and let the paper say what it said, and then she folded it along its original creases and set it beside the bread. She said, "You did not have to do that." She said it evenly, without tears, without drama, in the tone of a woman who is stating a fact and leaving space around it for the other person to say what they need to say. Daniel looked at her then, directly, the way he rarely looked at things he was not ready to put words to. He said, "I know." There was a pause that was not empty. Then he said that the children were going to need the spring, and the spring was on that land, and that was the practical reason. He said it in the tone of a man who is telling the truth, but who is aware he is not telling all of it, and who trusts that the person he is speaking to is intelligent enough to hear the part he left out. Willa looked at him for a moment with the full attention she usually kept turned inward. Then she went to the stove and moved the pot to the heat and said supper would be ready within the hour, and he said that was good. And Clara came in from the back room with Eli behind her, and the evening began to fill with the small, ordinary sounds of 4 people occupying a space together. A spoon against a pot, a child's voice asking something, the fire finding a new piece of wood and settling into it, the snow still coming down outside the window, soft and unhurrying, over the corral and the pines and the barn and all of it, the whole of the small world they had made without announcing that they were making it. The fire burned through the night. The snow kept. The horses stood quiet in the barn. The creek ran beneath its growing cover of ice, moving as it had always moved, as it would move come spring when the thaw came, and the fields on Willa's lease turned green again, and Clara learned to ride. And Eli named something else that did not yet have a name. The pines held the snow on their branches until they could not, and then released it, and stood again. The chimney sent its smoke straight up into the still cold air, and anyone passing on the road below the valley would have seen it, that thin line of smoke rising from Coldwater Ranch. and known that the house was warm and occupied, and that the people inside it had somewhere, without ceremony and without declaration, become the kind of people who intend to stay. And that was the story of Willa Beckett and Daniel Holt, a woman who arrived with flour on her hands and $11 and 2 children who were hers in every way that mattered, and who left the hard years behind, not by abandoning them but by outlasting them one Tuesday morning at a time, until the life she had quietly built around her turned out to be exactly enough, and then more than that. Let me know in the comments how this one felt. I hope it found you well. See you in the next one.